In 2018, the Trump administration embarked on an unprecedented trade policy, slapping tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods from China, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. These tariffs, framed as a means to protect American jobs and counter unfair trade practices, triggered a global trade war with far-reaching consequences. The move sent shockwaves through the global economy, disrupting supply chains, raising prices for consumers, and fueling uncertainty in international markets. The tariffs, primarily targeting China, were met with retaliatory measures from Beijing, escalating the trade conflict into a tit-for-tat exchange of economic sanctions. This trade war, far from achieving its stated goals, has had a ripple effect across industries, impacting businesses, farmers, and consumers alike. The economic fallout has been significant, with job losses reported in manufacturing and agriculture, sectors particularly vulnerable to trade disruptions. The Trump administration's aggressive trade policies have drawn criticism from economists and trade experts, who argue that tariffs ultimately harm American consumers and businesses by driving up costs and creating market instability. Beyond the immediate economic consequences, the trade war has strained diplomatic relations with key allies and cast a shadow over the future of global trade. The legality of Trump's tariffs has been fiercely contested, with numerous lawsuits filed by states, industry groups, and advocacy organizations. These legal challenges argue that the tariffs exceed the president's constitutional authority and represent an abuse of executive power. At the heart of these lawsuits lies the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the statute invoked by the Trump administration to justify its tariff actions. California, a state heavily reliant on international trade, has been at the forefront of the legal battle against the tariffs. The state's lawsuit argues that the tariffs have inflicted significant economic damage, disrupting supply chains, increasing costs for businesses and consumers, and undermining California's economic competitiveness. The Blackfeet Nation, a Native American tribe, has also filed a lawsuit, arguing that the tariffs have disproportionately harmed its economy, which relies heavily on agricultural exports. The tribe's lawsuit contends that the tariffs violate its treaty rights and have caused irreparable harm to its economic well-being. The New Civil Liberties Alliance and the Liberty Justice Center, two legal advocacy groups, have filed separate lawsuits challenging the tariffs on constitutional grounds. These lawsuits argue that the tariffs represent an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power to the executive branch and violate the separation of powers doctrine. The U.S. Constitution grants Congress the exclusive power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, a power that encompasses the authority to impose tariffs. While Congress has delegated some authority over trade to the president, the scope of this delegation and its limits have been the subject of ongoing legal debate. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, passed in 1977, grants the president broad authority to regulate international commerce during times of national emergency. However, the Act's language does not explicitly mention tariffs, and its legislative history suggests that it was not intended to be used as a tool for imposing sweeping trade restrictions. The Trump administration's use of IEEPA to justify its tariffs has been met with skepticism from legal scholars and critics who argue that the act was never intended to be used in this manner. They contend that the administration's broad interpretation of IEP stretches the statute beyond its intended scope and sets a dangerous precedent for executive overreach in matters of trade policy. The lawsuits challenging the tariffs argue that the Trump administration's actions violate the Constitution's separation of powers doctrine by usurping Congress's exclusive authority over tariffs. They contend that IEEPA, even if interpreted broadly, does not grant the president the power to impose tariffs without congressional authorization. The lawsuits challenging Trump's tariffs center on two key arguments: unlawful delegation of legislative power and abuse of emergency powers. The plaintiffs argue that the Trump administration's actions violate fundamental constitutional principles by exceeding the president's authority and encroaching on the powers of Congress. The unlawful delegation argument hinges on the principle that Congress cannot delegate its legislative powers to the executive branch without providing clear standards and guidelines. The plaintiffs contend that IEEPA, as applied to the tariffs, lacks the necessary specificity to guide the president's actions, effectively giving the executive branch a blank check to impose trade restrictions. The abuse of emergency powers argument focuses on the Trump administration's invocation of IEPA, which requires a finding of a national emergency to justify the exercise of its powers. The plaintiffs argue that the administration's declared emergencies, ranging from the opioid crisis to illegal immigration, are tenuous at best and do not meet the statutory threshold for invoking IEPA. Furthermore, the plaintiffs argue that the Trump administration's use of IEPA to impose tariffs is a dangerous expansion of executive power that undermines the Constitution's system of checks and balances. They contend that allowing the president to unilaterally impose tariffs under the guise of national emergency sets a dangerous precedent that could be abused by future administrations. In the past, tariffs were often used as tools during the Cold War, a time when economic strategies were just as important as military ones. But now, in the 21st century, these same tools are being wielded with a different intent. The question we face is whether these tariffs are being used as weapons in a new kind of economic warfare. Are they protecting national interests, or are they causing more harm than good? It's a complex issue, one that requires us to look at both the historical context and the current global landscape. The non-delegation doctrine and the major questions doctrine are two pivotal legal principles. The non-delegation doctrine asserts that Congress cannot delegate its legislative powers to other entities without clear guidelines. On the other hand, the major questions doctrine requires that Congress speak clearly when authorizing agency action on issues of vast economic and political significance. These doctrines serve as checks on executive authority, ensuring that significant decisions are made with clear legislative intent. Trade wars come with significant economic costs. Tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers, disruptions in supply chains, and strained international relations. Businesses may face increased costs for imported materials, which can result in higher prices for goods and services. Moreover, retaliatory tariffs from other countries can hurt domestic exporters, leading to job losses and economic instability. It's a complex web of consequences that often impacts the very people it aims to protect. Navigating the space between retaliation and relief is a delicate balancing act. When a country imposes tariffs, it often faces retaliatory measures from its trading partners. These retaliatory actions can escalate tensions and lead to a trade war, harming both economies. However, tariffs can also be used as a tool for relief, protecting domestic industries from unfair competition. The challenge lies in finding a strategy that mitigates harm while achieving the intended protective measures. Balancing presidential power and congressional prerogative is essential in a democratic system. The president has the authority to implement tariffs for national security or foreign policy reasons, but this power must be balanced with congressional oversight. Congress retains the power to regulate commerce and should provide clear guidelines and limitations on executive actions. This balance ensures that no single branch of government holds too much power, maintaining the checks and balances that are fundamental to our democracy.